It is 2 a.m. You're sitting in your room. The only light source comes from your monitor as you click play on another 80s inspired synth playlist on Spotify. You open up Minecraft and for a moment, all the stresses and worries in your life, your work, paying rent and bills, climate change, and oppression fleet from your mind. It is quiet and peaceful. Simple. I wish it could always be like this. But the modern day is instead full of fear, hate, and chaos. There is an overstimulation of content and an oversaturation of choices regarding every aspect of your life. Clothing trends, phone models, social media presence. Every small, minute detail of our life determines our values and worth on a societal level. And if you fall behind, your value falls. You yearn for a time where things were simple, where you didn't feel so tethered to the black mirror of our devices, where you didn't feel constantly observed and judged by society and its members. You find yourself nostalgic for a time you've never known. I'm not sure how much of a universal feeling this is, but I do find myself experiencing this sense of nostalgia for a time I've never known. Finding myself awake at 3 a.m, putting on another Vaporwave playlist where the thumbnail is Xenosyte and looking sad, and overall, just this feeling of drowning as I desire to escape this capitalist hellhole and all of its problems. Just this need to escape. It is truly difficult to describe and visualize, but it's not like that feeling of sitting here thinking, oh, I was born in the wrong generation. It's more like wanting to escape to your childhood, but it's not even your specific childhood you're wishing to escape to. This childhood feeling that I yearn for appears more so in the form of an 80s middle class America suburbia atmosphere. Except I was born in 1997. I grew up in a lower class Australian household. TV shows like Stranger Things and Paper Girls, where you have scenes of this ragtag of kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in their basement, going on paper routes together, rigging up radio towers in a hot 80s summer day. It just fills you with this reminder of this childhood curiosity and naivety that I so envy. It paints a perfect picture of simpler times, and all I can do is just watch there and dream. This desire to escape, to just experience that one more time. Except once again, I never experienced that. I grew up in a lower class Australian household in the early 2000s. But I cannot shake off that feeling of nostalgia. And I do believe this phenomenon is widely experienced, and I think it will continue to grow as popular media continues to romanticize the 80s and even 90s era. We have playlists on Spotify called POV, You're Driving a Car at Night and it's the 80s, and similar titles like that even on YouTube too. There are whole music subgenres like synthwave and retrowave, whose entire purpose, the whole point of these subgenres is to invoke that feeling of 80s nostalgia. Some in a more fun Miami Vice way, and some in a more somber way. And I think people in my age bracket, those born between 1997 and 2000s, are in a particularly weird boat about it. We were too young to really appreciate what the 90s had to offer, yet too old to really find ourselves immersed in social media as we see in younger Gen Z. I was too young to really be aware and understand the internet as it was forming itself and these communities begin cementing itself and flourishing as we find the internet finding a place in society. Yet, definitely too old to really understand the need to have every single social media account and to be constantly in tune and plugged in and connected with everything. I never had Vine. I only really started caring about Vine after it was shut down and all the really funny memes of, Vines that butter my egg rolls compilations were popping off on YouTube. I only got a TikTok last year, and even now I don't use it every day. Some days I will scroll half an hour, but even then I don't really engage socially with the platform. I had a Facebook. Facebook's been kind of overtaken by the boomers anyway. I didn't really engage with Snapchat when it was a big thing. I don't have an Instagram. I've never have, and maybe I'll make one day. Maybe. The only social media that I really engaged with was Twitter and Tumblr. I don't really use Tumblr anymore, and I'm using Twitter less and less these days. And yet, with all of these social media platforms and this need to be constantly connected, I feel this pressure of needing that constant validation on social media and to be constantly engaged, this fear of missing out on, the latest memes or news and such like that. I recognize that there's a pressure there, and I feel it to an extent. I'm able to push past it, but I cannot understand how young kids these days don't fucking snap under that pressure. They grew up with this pressure, this need to be so presently online and to be so interconnected with an unfathomable amount of people. I get how that is overwhelming and how that really complicates your sense of self and your perception on life and life experiences. This overwhelming feeling accompanied with this sense of not really belonging to either era, I feel is what really appeals that 80s nostalgia to people like me and in my boat. We find ourselves overwhelmed with today's world, and people in my age bracket don't even really have a simple childhood we can look back at fondly, because within our childhood, technology moved so quickly. We kind of found ourselves sandwiched between two different eras and not really finding ourselves at home with either one. But then we hear this 80s inspired retrowave playlist with a video loop of a DeLorean driving through a neon gridscape, and next thing we know, it's 3 a.m. and we feel kind of understood by this video. We feel heard. More importantly, we feel this desire to capture this feeling we have within us and experience it forever. We create an idea of an era that suits us, that we can yearn for and feel nostalgic for. A simple time where we can go out on a hot summer day and eat ice cream while wearing geometric patterned clothing, put on a cassette tape of a fun retrowave playlist, and then go home, sit in front of the television and put on a fun movie where the cop is a kung fu martial artist and he's killing Hitler. But the reality is, the 80s that we yearn for, that we desire, it's nothing more than a lie. There's a reason why it's called nostalgic for a time I've never known. The reality is, the 80s was just as complicated and just as overwhelming as today's era. The 80s we see in the modern day in TV shows like Stranger Things. That's not actually the 80s. Don't get me wrong, I understand that the Duffer Brothers grew up in the 80s. I'm not saying they don't know what they're talking about. They certainly know a lot more than I when it comes to the 80s. In fact, I know that various people who grew up in the 80s watched the show and they're able to experience that feeling of nostalgia. They're able to look at the show and feel that fond memory of their quote-unquote simple childhood just by watching the show. But Stranger Things only really highlights the good parts of the 80s. The parts that one can easily feel a sense of familiarity with. The stuff that's easy to digest and provide good nostalgic fuel as audience watch with envy as they wish they can go back to those simpler times. But the reality is, the 80s had their own fair share of oppression and existential dread. Being gay in the 80s was an existential nightmare within itself, especially as a gay man, as either you were falling victim or you feared falling victim to a disease that politicians were actively ignoring until it started affecting heterosexual people, at which point many gay men unfortunately had lost their lives. Not to then also mention the hate crimes that many gay and queer people, including transgender people, experienced at that time. I know that if I had lived in the 80s, I would have either stayed in the closet or had found myself victim to some kind of hate crime due to my queer and transgender status. At least today, I have the luxury to be open about who I am in the workplace and with family and friends. And while I understand that not every queer person in progressive countries, even like Australia and America and the UK, can say that today, I think it'd be wrong to not acknowledge that things have even slightly improved since the 80s. And I even understand, while speaking right now, we are in the midst of a moral trans panic, as there are debates regarding the existence of people like myself. I understand that in 3 years' time, maybe, I'd probably be telling a different story. But for now, it's at least a little better. Being queer in the 80s, I can only imagine, must have been filled with this overwhelming feeling of existential dread, as you had to make this tough choice of living authentically as yourself or remaining in the closet. Either way, you were going to struggle. With that, suddenly the 80s feels a lot less vibrant and colourful, with a cool retro wave track playing in the background. And then there's the Red Scare, an existential dread felt by many Americans and Australians from the 50s to the 80s, all throughout the West. While tensions between the US and Russia weren't as high in the 80s as they were in the 60s, Armageddon still loomed amongst the average person who had no idea that the USSR was going to fall in less than a decade. As far as they were aware of, the big red Iron Curtain was a threat to their everyday life. Everyday folks genuinely believed that at the time, the big red Iron Curtain threatened every aspect of their life. And the media at the time only perpetuated those fears. It seems really silly now, and when I watch it, it feels like parody, it feels satirical. The opening scene in the 80s action movie Escape from New York really was designed to perpetuate that sense of fear that the everyday American felt. You have a communist Russian sympathizer kidnapping the President of the United States within the presidential's plane and crashing it into the city of New York, all in the name of communism. It was a genuine fear felt by everyday Americans at that time. This fear that at any moment communism was going to upend everything they knew in life, or at worst, their future was to be affected by communism. And while the nuclear threat didn't loom over Americans in the 80s nearly as strongly as it did in the 50s and the 60s, the threat of nuclear Armageddon still loomed. There's the 1983 false alarm Soviet incident that saw the Soviets almost press the big red button and jumpstart the nuclear extinction event over a false alarm. Nuclear anxiety was actually something studied in the 80s amongst adolescents and young people. In fact, the 80s was where we saw the first inception of the term nuclear anxiety and what it meant. And nuclear anxiety is something that is observed today, partially due to the war happening in Eastern Europe, partially because we have these world superpowers who still have nuclear warheads, and it's only one incident, or at worst, one false incident away from those warheads going off. And then we have the atomic experts who have pushed the doomsday clock as close it's ever been to midnight. So if you have nuclear anxiety and you're trying to escape to the 80s to alleviate those anxieties, you're kind of out of luck there. They were also very anxious about nuclear war. And while it's easy now to say that technology at the time was just so much simpler as it is today, I don't think people at the time would agree with you. I get the feeling that the progression of technology at the time, while may have been exciting for many, was also absolutely terrifying. The reality is the progression of technology meant change in society, and us humans, we hate change. We don't like change, we don't like what change means. Change is confusing and threatens our way of life and the way we understand life as we know it. And honestly, we talk about FOMO now, this fear of missing out when it comes to, the latest iPhone models and such like that, or phone models in general. For example, FOMO very much would have existed then, for similar reasons as they do today. Instead of phones back then, it probably would have been the television, and in their case, the size of your television screen. The bigger the size of your television, the wealthier you were. If you didn't have a big television, your value in society would not have been as high. Honestly, I would not be surprised if people in the 80s were yearning and desiring for the simpler times of the 70s and the 60s, and I without a doubt would also believe that those in the 70s and the 60s were very much yearning and desiring for the simpler times of the 50s. I kind of think those in the 50s may have been the only people, or I don't know, I could be wrong on this, but they're probably one of the few generations in human history that didn't really yearn or desire for their previous generations. I think the 50s was pretty content being in the 50s and not being in the 30s or 40s. So, good for you, 50s. Good job. You did it. You found contentment in your era. My point is, us modern people of the year 2023 are yearning for simpler times, and thanks to popular media and mainstream media, we've dubbed the 80s as this quote-unquote simpler times, this era that we wish to escape to. But the reality is the 80s had their fair share of challenges that provided a sense of complexity and overwhelming fear amongst the people during that time. For many in the 80s, life was anything but simple. And if we truly did escape to the 80s, we'd probably encounter the similar problems and feelings as we do now. We'd probably just look a bit aesthetically cooler while doing so. I don't believe there is anything wrong with laying in your bed, listening to an 80s inspired vaporwave playlist and wishing to escape to those simpler times. In fact, I find it quite fascinating that there's a whole community on the internet dedicating to creating this very specific nostalgia core, and everyone there collectively decided that the 80s would be the era to drive this inspiration from. But I do think it's important to understand where and why we feel the way we feel. The reality is, we don't want to escape to the 80s. The 80s we have in our minds, our perception of the 80s, is a superficial, manufactured one created through popular media and rose-tinted glasses. The 80s, while it has a fun aesthetic, and I'm sure is looked back fondly by many of those who grew up in it, did have their fair sense of complexity, complication, fears, and problems. What we yearn for What we truly desire is to simply escape the modern day. The pressures of social media and its judgmental eyes prying at us, the anxieties of climate change, the never-ending weight of capitalism crushing us as the cost of living rise and our wages stagnate, or sometimes just flat out robbed from us. But the reality is, many of us can't escape our living situation. Whether it's social connections, obligations, or simply just finances, most of us can't just pack our bags and escape our current life. And honestly, even if we did escape, new problems would just arise. Because the unfortunate truth is, life is just complicated. And for as long as we live, we will find a way to make life even more complicated for us. As technology continues to advance at unprecedented rates, Marvel continues to drop dozens of movies per year, making it impossible to keep up with the MCU. Megacorps continue to find a way to mine our data to use it against us for profits, and as politicians continue to ignore us as we beg and scream for security in our future on this blue planet that we call home. So maybe there's nothing wrong with laying in bed at 2 a.m. and putting on another chill wave playlist, and just for a moment, we can escape to a time we've never known.